And this is the second of the sports analytics themed talks. So for those that attended the first one, a little bit of the beginning might be familiar, but then there's going to be a bunch of new content all about the draft. Because the beginning of this, I want to emphasize how now what NFL teams have access to. Thinking about the NFL draft coming up. This used to be NFL teams, coaches would watch film, scouts watch film, assess players, making subjective decisions about the cuts, the movements that players are making. This is an example of Saquon Barkley, running back, moving around. Defenders are trying to stop him, tackle him. But now in the NFL, we have chips in the shoulder pads, literally picking up every 10th of a second where everybody is at on the field. And so what you're seeing here is a recreation of that play with the tracking data that is gathered throughout every single NFL game. So Saquon Barkley is highlighted here in this circle, moving across the field, trying to go up towards the end zone. And what we can pick up on is not just like the locations of all the other players on the field, but then physical measurements about, for instance, Saquon Barkley. And we can observe here, over the course of time in the play, what is his momentum that he's carrying to the end zone that he's running towards. So how fast he's moving, coupled with his actual physical size. And then we can observe where are the different moments where players are maybe coming into near contact with Barkley and could potentially increase the chance of tackling him, stopping him, and observing these actual moments where there are drops in Barkley's momentum he's carrying forward. And so all of this now, all this tracking data that's being generated, this is what teams are using and taking advantage of to actually try to measure traits. And so I like to really stress that in this era, we're getting, at least in football, what we're seeing, and this has been the case in baseball for many years, the analysts themselves have been pulled closer and closer to the concepts that coaches and scouts are thinking about. And so I like to use this example with regards to the traits of athletes, where I have two, one's a current Steelers receiver, another's a former Steelers receiver. Where on the left-hand side, you have DK Metcalf, who, this was a clip when he was in college. After he catches the ball, he looks like he's a robot, just running as fast as he can, straight possible speed. But on the right, you have George Pickens, where after George Pickens caught the ball, he's bouncing around, right? He's moving, he's navigating, he's changing his direction a lot. And previously, coaches, scouts, they would be thinking about this a trait like the ability of an athlete to change their direction mid-play. But historically, in order to actually measure that type of trait and other traits that these football players might have, they would be relying on going to the NFL Combine, having these athletes in tank tops and gym shorts, putting them onto a field with no one around them except these cones, and clicking on a stopwatch, recording when they start, finish, and whatnot. Right? It was these contrived drills to get these measurements. These were not coming from in-game. But now we have the tracking data in-game. Right? We have the capability to get these measurements. And this has led to the NFL Combine becoming lowered in terms of importance. More and more NFL teams are not sending their head coach. They're not sending their general manager, because they can actually exploit so much more data that they have access to. So in this case of thinking about change of direction, literally based on that tracking data I was showing you, thinking about the steps that could be taking place, successive steps, and then this angle that could be between different steps, which players then could have the most amount of different angles that they could observe, higher differences in angles that could happen versus someone like DK Metcalf, who might never have really an angle change after he catches the ball. He's just running in a straight line, versus someone like George Pickens, who could be going back and forth, back and forth. And then so when we did this work, Kwong Wen was sitting in the back. A leaderboard, just to give you a sense of this, of how we can actually pick up on things that physically, we're seeing, scouts, coaches are seeing with their eye. And this is a leaderboard where DK Metcalf, during this period of time, he was the top player in terms of not changing his direction after he caught the ball. And on the exact opposite side was George Pickens, who was always changing his direction after he caught the ball. Now, this is not to say that one is better than the other, but it's a trait that these athletes have. And there are a number of other traits that, teams are trying to get a sense of. What's a player's top speed that they can achieve? What's a player's acceleration off the line of scrimmage that they might have? These are all different quantities that they're trying to measure. And even though I talked about this in the sense of what's available at the NFL with the tracking data, we have the capability of using computer vision AI tools to create that same type of data all across NFL college football film that we have access to. So what teams rely on is they get tracking data from college football film. So this is an example of just a process of taking broadcast video, detecting where are players at on that video, identifying who is just on the field. And then we could take this same type of video feed and we can make that XY positioning that I showed you that we have in the NFL. And then we can compute all of those same types of measurements. And so this is a whole industry within sports. It is these companies that they are data providers. And there are several different competitors trying to do the same type of thing. And they differ in how they ship these products. And so I'm giving you an example of is one company, Teamworks, where there's a Carnegie Mellon alum, Doug Fearing, who's their chief data officer, where what they have is they have a product that literally is taking college football film and they're providing a service where, yes, they'll extract and convert that film to that type of tracking data that we can pick up on these different traits, but they're giving tools to coaches. So you can see a play diagram on this right-hand side here, and then it's overlaid onto the film itself. Because this is what coaches and scouts are doing. They are constantly watching film to assess players and thinking about, oh, these were the routes they were running. We could overlay, instead of what was the observed path, what would have been the optimal type of path they should have took? What would have been the path that we typically see? Or where could they have been if they move with a certain speed? This is all helping decision makers think about how to evaluate players, right, based on this rich amount of information that's available. So this is going from just purely subjective scouting to bringing in data to help make better evaluations of players and their traits. All right, and it's really I'm just giving you an example of Teamworks is one company. There's company Huddle StatsBomb, Skill Corner. They're all competing within the NFL and other sports leagues to take video feeds of various leagues that have amateur players or players across different leagues that a professional team might be scouting and trying to bring in, right? NHL teams are trying to convert International Hockey League video into tracking data themselves to find out which skaters are the fastest skaters, which skaters are more in the best optimal positions to take shots, right? This is all data that these teams, it's a gold mine for them that they're bringing in and trying to gather. Now, this is just the first step of evaluating, right? Getting objective evaluation measurements. But the theme of this is, all right, we're talking about the draft, right? After we get measurements, we still have to figure out, well, where are we going to draft people, right? How do we decide where players are going to go? And yes, we could use AI, we use data to help us evaluate players, but how do we figure out what's going to happen in the draft? And the idea of understanding and going back and predicting what's going to go on the draft, this is an industry of itself. This is the mock draft industry. I have a picture here of Mel Kiper. He's probably one of the most famous people of doing mock drafts for ESPN, all these different years. Todd McShay on the bottom right. There's actually a Carnegie Mellon alum, Ryan Wilson, who writes for CBS Sports, who also does mock drafts. Right? There's so many different people that are all trying to write up what they think is going to happen in the NFL draft, right? They're basing it off of information, right, that they're processing in some way. Maybe they have their subjective beliefs that they're bringing in. Maybe they also are coupling that with objective knowledge. They might be thinking about team needs. They might be thinking about the quality of players. There's writers at ESPN who are looking at tracking data and how they think about which players are better fits where, right? But there's thousands of mock drafts that exist, right? And so if we think about, well, how can we predict what could happen? It's less optimal to just consider, oh, I'm going to use Mel Kiper to predict the draft. And yes, Mel Kiper on his own might be pretty knowledgeable, but he's just a single individual with a single point of view. And if I think about trying to get optimal predictions, why don't I take advantage of all of these mock drafts that are out there? Right? And this gets at this idea of wisdom of the crowds to really help with predictions and decision making. And one of these resources that's very popular now in the NFL is this website called Grinding the Mocks. It was set up by Benjamin Robinson, who actually presented the initial version of this project at our Carnegie Mellon Sports Analytics Conference a long time ago. And now he's gone on to be a data provider to the NFL, as well as many different NFL teams. They buy the data that what he does is he scours the web for just what are mock drafts, and he's compiling them. And he's averaging across them. So rather than just only looking at Mel Kiper, let's look at Mel Kiper, Todd McShay, CBS, ESPN, whatever, and all of these different things. And based on all of these different mock drafts that are out there, let's average across them and get a sense of where could be players going. So here, what I'm showing you is Fernando Mendoza, who is effectively going to be the #1 overall pick. All right, that is the consensus. And you can see how this is being picked up, where based on mock draft data, what he's showing is collections of different drafts, collection of different mock drafts, coded by whether or not they were like an expert or just some fan type of mock draft that he was gathering. And yes, mock drafts begin very early. Right, so the initial mock drafts about Fernando Mendoza being taken within just the first round here. This is back before the summer. All right, the previous summer. So this is a long time ago when people were already making predictions about what's going to happen in the draft. And then you can see, all right, once the college football season actually starts in August, on average, he has this steady climb up the mock draft leaderboards, right? Eventually, it gets to a point where he's the consensus #1 overall pick, right, across a variety. Now, that's not to say everybody says he's the #1 overall pick. There's still variability that we observe here. But this is picking up on what is provided from potentially, in this case, he had over 2,200 mock drafts that he was included in. Right? So that's a lot of information that we could account for to make better predictions. Right? This is this wisdom of the crowds idea that powers a lot of machine learning methodology that leads to better predictions of the future, rather than relying on just a single individual taking a consensus across many that could have independent sets of views. And that has been found to lead to more optimal predictions. And this idea then of using mock drafts, you can get a story. I found this player, to be frank with you, I have no idea who this player is. But I was looking for different examples of which players were rising or falling in some way. And this was an athlete, he's a safety for Oregon, where he was considered good, going to be in a first-round pick. And then he's decayed based on his performance in the season. And then what happens is the NFL Combine happens, and he looks like this amazing athlete all of a sudden, and he shoots back up. Right? So there's no games taking place effectively after the college football playoffs in January. But the NFL Combine takes place, and that leads to this swing in this consensus about where he might go. Right, so we observe these various different types of patterns of how people will believe players will be taken. And this gets at a pretty decent view of predicting the NFL draft. Right, just aggregating over these mock drafts gives you a decent sense of what teams will do. It's baking in, hopefully, a lot of different information. Right, Mel Kiper, other folks at ESPN, they're thinking about team needs. Sure, Mel Kiper might think that last year, for instance, Shedeur Sanders should have went a lot earlier. But he was wrong about that potentially. But he could have been right on a number of different other facets, while others that had mock drafts could have had a different view. Right? So the idea is averaging over across these can actually enable us to have a better sense of what's going on. And so this grinding the mocks, as I mentioned, this has become a pretty popular resource. NFL teams are having this behind the scenes for themselves. They're able to view this because they want to have a good sense of, well, where does the public think certain players are going to go? Right? They want to know and have for them for decision making. Where do we think certain players will be taken? So I do want to give a mention here that this type of draft data and this grinding the mocks is available into the NFL IQ platform. So the NFL IQ platform, you can scan the QR code for that. What it is the NFL Next Gen Stats has really put together this fantastic resource for people to check out big draft leaderboards, various types of metrics that they compile from tracking data. And they've also developed an AI chat tool. And the work by Kwong Wen in the back next week will actually get to be fed into this tool, and people will be able to actually ask questions that extract insights from his research, which will be exciting. And so you'll be able to work with this, but I do want to point out, like, different aspects of this grinding the mocks that I mentioned, it's already built into this platform. All right, so you can see here, I'm showing you the Steelers as an example, and they're displaying in this mock draft preview, 14% of the mock drafts have the Steelers taking QB Ty Simpson in the first round. All right, now that's a fairly high fraction, so that's a consensus prediction, but it doesn't mean it's a guarantee, right? So that's the most likely predicted pick according to these mocks. But then we see variation here. We see a number of different wide receivers with a high chance, as well as a guard with a high chance. So this is a pretty cool tool that you could check out if you're interested in navigating more data in the NFL draft. So thinking about then, like, this idea of, okay, we could have these mock drafts, and that could give you a good sense, like, going in to the draft of, you know, what could be happening, right? Teams, what they're doing is they're coming up with metrics to evaluate players, and they're coming up with, you know, what is their board entering a draft, right? Where are we going to take players? And we're going to rely on potentially a lot of this mock draft information to help figure out, well, when will certain players be available? But that mock draft information won't be enough, right? Because teams, in order to make decisions about who they're going to take, they really need access to live tools to help understand, well, what if another NFL team makes a trade? They trade up, and now what impact could that be on who we're going to be able to take at our pick? And so what teams will work on is developing models to simulate the draft. And so I'm showing you an example here of an NHL draft model. So I'm not going into the mathematical details, but what each cell is indicating here, along the bottom are the teams, and I believe this was the 2022 NHL draft, right? So the columns are the teams, the rows were the players. And so what a team will do is figure out, well, what's the probability a player will be taken in a certain pick by a team, right? And so this is ordered by which players are expected to be taken earliest. And so the top player, based on this model, was Shane Wright. So he has the highest probability of being taken in as a first overall pick. And then he has some substantial amount of probability being taken second, but very low probability based on this model that he'll be taken later in the first round, because he's really like a consensus first round pick. And then we can see, well, all right, we go to the next player, Logan Coley. He's a high probability of being taken second overall because of how Shane Wright had such a high first overall pick probability, but there's a non-zero chance he's the first overall pick, as well as the third, and it decays quickly. And you can see as you go throughout the round, this model could be forecasting, well, there's a lot more uncertainty after we get outside like the top 10, right? After we get outside the top 10 players, then we don't know what could be going on in terms of where players could be taken in the first round. Now, this could be a view beforehand, right? And teams, based on this modeling, where they'll take the mock draft data, they'll take team needs that they believe, they'll take factors such as, well, what's the team salary situation? How much do we believe that this team will spend? Baseball is a very unique draft where there's an allotment of how much they spend based on where they're taken in the pick. And so teams will factor in, well, all right, they'll spend so much on the amateur side because they don't spend as much on the free agency side or whatnot. And how much do they allocate, or will that impact if they take a high school player versus a college player? All of that tries to get brought into these models. And then you can think, well, once we have a model, we could simulate. And so what I'm doing here is showing, all right, we could simulate and say, oh, the most likely player would be taken first, second, and third. And then that just changes what we're going to be seeing later on. But reality often doesn't reflect what takes place. And so here is actually the actual draft, what happened. Shane Wright did not go first overall. Instead, who went first overall was someone whose name I'm not going to be able to pronounce because this is hockey. And then we have another person who I'll butcher that name, and Logan Coley went third. But this alters, right, how these players are being taken and who they already took. That's being brought into this model. And then we can see how dynamically that will adjust where Shane Wright, he has the highest probability of being taken with this fourth pick because it's so surprising that he's still available. And maybe this model's missing information. Right? This model might not know something. Maybe there was a news report that came out about Shane Wright. I actually have no idea. Right? This is a real example. But again, this is a dynamic update that we could have to get a sense of what could be going on throughout the draft in real time. And then what teams can do is they try to leverage this to help them make better decisions, right? Having these estimates of these probabilities and being able to simulate, do we think we'll be able to take a player? So in this case, this is an example of taking a particular player where the Dallas, what they had was so many picks that already happened, highlighted here in pink, right? So now Dallas is currently with the 15th overall pick, and they have a decision to make. Their next pick is the 47th pick. So they could decide, well, what if we could take this player, or maybe we decide to trade back, right? We could decide to trade back with Detroit and allow them to move up, because do we believe this player will still be available? And what you're seeing here is the model's estimates of the probabilities this player will still be available. And so it's very high early, right? And it's a 100% chance the team could take this player because they have the pick right now. And then we see a decay where if we move back, that'd be good not to break the TV. If we move back to that pick with Detroit, if we make that trade, we still have a 98% chance of him being available to take. And so Dallas actually made this trade with Detroit. Right? So they moved back. Detroit did not take that player. And as it turns out, they were able to take that player with this much later pick. And this model can inform them on, well, we really like this player. That's our next best player. We have pretty high confidence that that player is still going to be available. And that can help literally within the draft make the decision of, do we make this trade or not? Because that's our next target player. And then we see at a certain point when that probability drops off. Right? So these types of models that are being built, it's beforehand evaluating players. Then it's figuring out where are players going to the draft. And then within the draft itself, using these tools to understand how can we make better decisions about, do we make a trade with regards to the pick, or should we take this player at this spot? Because what do we think is going to happen within the draft, right? And so one of the challenging aspects of this, these can be pretty intensive models, and the draft is a pretty fast-paced environment other than the baseball draft. It's going through pretty quickly, and so teams have to have access to that information fairly quick in order to say, all right, should we make this trade or not? Yes or no? We're on the clock. Right? You can't have some computer sit there for 10 hours to help you make this decision. It already has to be happening. Right? The answer needs to be made already. And often needs to be made in such a way that a general manager can look at it and be informed in what they decide to do. Right, so having graphics, this might not even be the best graphic for a general manager. Right? Maybe you just need a red light or a green light. This is a nice statistical graphic in the sense. All right. Any questions about this so far? It's an excellent question. So the question is about, how do you think about differences in the positions and the types of contracts that the different positions will have, and whether or not the contract status of which will have fully guaranteed contracts. So I'm just repeating the question probably. But and so with that, part of the challenge I will say with dealing with position is for a trade, when a trade happens, do you know what position they're going to take? You're absolutely right that there could be very differences in these values. And also just think of the differences in for a given pick in the draft, what proportion are QB versus wide receiver versus defensive back and whatnot? And so the idea is averaging over that kind of handles the positional balance that changes. And so the actual value could be a function of the composition of the position changing over the draft, which can be fine, right? Now you're right though that there are, if we can make these curves by position. And you can see, well, what does the surplus look if we just have a QB specific curve versus a wide receiver specific curve? And you can see some slightly different patterns, right? And one of the positions that I know people have looked at where it's kind of unique is offensive linemen, where there's a lot of surplus basically for all from like rounds 2 or 7. It's a very different looking curve because it's a very different looking cost. Yeah, so it's a great question, and this is kind of just averaging over that positional differences that take place. But the performance themselves will impact what can happen. Another thing you have to deal with when constructing these is the players that don't get that second contract. All right, so what do we do with them? Do we just put 0 in for them, or how do we handle the fact that maybe they didn't get second contract because some unusual event took place, right? Did something happen? Did a freak injury happen where maybe if they didn't get hurt, if they continue to play, they would have been expected to get some reasonable contract value, right? And that could change how we also impute these values to construct these curves too. So there's a lot of tricks and challenges with setting these types of curves up properly. Yeah, it's a great point. Like the positional differences can definitely matter here. Yeah, question. Yeah, that's another excellent question, right? Thinking of, given the fact that like this is just based on that second contract value, and the second contract might not actually be reflective of the true value of the player, right? And what else could we possibly do? And so that's been something that people have been trying to work on, right? Is can we come up with, in baseball, a very popular stat is wins above replacement. So based on the different types of data we have about players, can we somehow estimate how much were they worth to the team? And then what we could do is convert these wins to like a dollar value, knowing, all right, there's some dollar equivalent for a win to an NFL team based on what's brought in with a relationship between team's record and revenue that they're bringing in and whatnot. And then based on that, could we say this is what actually is the appropriate value for their contract, right? Instead of just using what is the observed second contract that could be biased in different ways. Right? If a certain team might have, certain owners might behave in some irrational ways with how they sign players, and maybe we could have a more realistic notion of a player's value instead. We could use that for the curve. Now, the nice thing is like this actual cost curve, this is dictated by the pick. This is something that we can actually just straight up use based on where they get in the pick. But the value that they're providing in order to get at the surplus, that is an open question. Right? There's different ways. And like what I just said is far easier said than done. Coming up with effectively like an asset value for a player. Like, do we actually have a good idea of disentangling? And this is something I talked about in the last session of, how much credit does one football player deserve over another within what's going on in a play? And it's not an easy question. People have come up with different notions of performance value, whether that's just looking at games played as a simple thing of, let's see how many games played does a player have at a later point in their career, like within a 3 to 5 year window that kind of corresponds to if they're getting a second contract. And just seeing, how does that number of games played change, right? Which picks are associated with a high number of games played? Because if they're not playing games, they're not very good. Right? They're losing their starting status, and they're maybe just becoming like a background role player, or they're no longer signed by a team. So that's like a simpler notion, but to turn it into dollars to get the surplus, that remains a very hard step. That's been the benefit of using like the second contract is, all right, we can compare that to the cost, and then we can get this idea of surplus. but maybe that surplus is just an artifact of whatever biases come in with that second contract value. Yeah. A question online? So if I heard correctly, so the question is about the NFL draft following wisdom of the crowds, and are we getting a better sense of it using tracking data? Is that the idea? So yeah, it's a good question of thinking of like, I talked about these mock draft compilations earlier, right? Of seeing like, okay, given all these mock drafts, where players could be going, could you couple that, if I'm understanding the question correctly, like, could you couple that with other like types of statistics to forecast where players could be taken? That's part of like what these models teams could be building, right? And now I don't personally know if the mocks are improving over time. That's an interesting question that one could look at. Is are the mock drafts in 2026, 2025, 2024, like, are they more informative than the mock drafts from 20 years ago? I don't know, right? This is part of the challenge with sports, is it can be very dynamic, right? And there's a role at play here where the teams themselves are looking at the mock drafts. Is that guiding their own decision making? And is that maybe making the mock drafts more predictable, the draft more predictable in the sense based on the mocks? That remains to be something that could be studied, though. So good question. I don't have an answer for it, though. Any other questions, folks? Yeah. Yeah, so it's a great question. So the question is about if players play, athletes play multiple sports, and you can have athletes that are getting drafted in both sports. Right? There's been players that have been drafted in the MLB draft. Russell Wilson, who was the Steelers QB last year, he was drafted in baseball, and then decided to go back and continue college football, and then eventually was drafted in the NFL. Kyler Murray was one who was the #1 overall draft pick in the NFL, but was also a first-round draft pick in baseball. And like, what signal could that provide? And so one thing I do know for certain is there are companies that what they are doing is trying to aggregate and collect data about athletes when they're in high school. Are they playing football? Are they then competing in track and field? Are they playing baseball? Are they playing basketball? Who are these multi-sport athletes? And then seeing that it can actually be very predictive of better performance at the top collegiate level that maybe then could carry over in the professional level. You see far fewer professional football players that played multiple collegiate sports. That number has gone down, but they're definitely multi-sport athletes at a lower level. And so that could be very valuable information. It's harder information to gather and to collect, right? Setting up databases about high school performances. And so there are companies that literally, that is a data service that they provide, is they are gathering that information about multi-sport athletes. Can they build metrics that say this is a better competitive athlete based on the fact that we see how well they swim, we see how well they perform in basketball, and they're going to be an amazing wide receiver potentially, right? So it's definitely something that teams think about and look for. Good question. All right. Yeah. Question. Yeah. So I mentioned it. I talked a bit about this at the beginning in terms of, so the question about like how's an event like the combine changing, where the goal of the combine was about getting these physical measurements. And we talked a bit about it at the beginning, where like with the tracking data now, there's things that maybe we don't even need to have measured at the combine. The flip side of that is, based on the tracking data, the NFL has actually created new drills to be put into the combine about certain aspects that they didn't think about before, related to things like route running that they could observe from the tracking data. And so that's led to creating new parts, new things to do in that combine for them to measure in a very controlled way, right? So it has gone hand in hand in the sense that even if maybe there's been a de-emphasis of teams on just like doing like the 40-yard times, now you can actually use the data to figure out what are better drills to measure those in-game traits that we're very interested in. And part of the combine experiences, as Rebecca was mentioning, was every year at the combine is the NFL's Big Data Bowl. And so the combine now features this gathering for their annual competition that's based on that tracking data, where you have researchers coming in presenting their work. We've had multiple finalists. Kwong in the back's been a finalist twice in this competition, and demonstrating like new ideas with that type of data. So that's a big analytics celebration. What people are doing with stats, AI, machine learning with football tracking data. And I would argue like it's in and of itself, it's a combine for sports analytics. We've attended this event, and representatives from MLB teams, NHL, NBA teams, they're attending it because they want to see, all right, who are these people that are presenting? Maybe they're not running a 40-yard dash, but they're doing some very cool, interesting data analysis work. Yeah. Cool. All right. Another question? Yeah, so kind of connected to the beginning. I'd say like we do uh, a lot of work with this tracking data, right? Of thinking about how do we pick up on these movements, and so Kwong Wen, who's in the back, he's been doing a lot of work on how do we actually model that change of direction was one example, but the ability of a player to actually speed up or slow down in some way, right? Build models of their movement to get a better sense of which players display that trait or not. And then I kind of talked about this in the first session, of thinking about like what's the value of different moments of time within plays, right? To say how many points was like a cut a running back made worth, right? Because then can we credit that running back with making that movement? And then compiling that and doing this accounting over all these different movements that took place. And so we do a lot of different work on that sense. And I personally, outside of just working with the tracking data, kind of have fun with a variety of student projects across different sports, thinking about other different types of problems with the data that we get access to, whether that's with rule changes or new technology that gathers information like the length of a swing in a baseball game, to thinking about like what's the impact of the ABS system? How does that alter behavior on whether a batter is swinging or not? Or how does that alter an umpire's decision to call certain pitches strikes or balls, right? So that's coming from statistical techniques. So that's the types of sports problems I like to think about and work on. Yeah. Yeah, so a question about like organizations that like produce one number that's like not very open source, right? We don't know the details of it. And I'd say it's it's a service they try to provide in whatever way. And maybe there's a lot of criticism for it. And one of the things that makes it challenging for any of these outside organizations, especially in football, is we don't know the role that the player was supposed to have. So if you watch an NFL game, you watch a player on defense, there's a decent chance the player might be making a mistake, right? Because teams call these plays, they have these schemes, and then as someone on defense could be literally running the wrong way, and they'll be messing up. But we won't know because we think, oh, the NFL player, look, they're covering that guy, but they were actually supposed to be in the middle of the field manning some particular zone. Right, but we won't know because we're outsiders and we don't have access to the true play call. So that's probably, besides like the process of putting a number on like an athlete, like that's probably the biggest criticism any of this external work will do, is we don't actually have access to the true information that the team has, and that could limit the ability to say, well, if the quarterback threw an interception because the wide receiver ran a different way, who was at fault? Maybe the QB was at the fault. Maybe the receiver was at fault. We as an outsider, we don't know. We just see if Aaron Rodgers screams at somebody. All right, another question online? So how can the professional data account for the longevity of a college student athlete in the draft process? It's an interesting question. So I will say, like, if you think about the longevity of a college athlete, playing time, career length has been one of the most valuable predictors of success from the collegiate level into the NFL level. All right, players that have an extensive starting career at the college level, that tends to be correlated with better success in the NFL. And now I will say, like, this is a very, the dynamic of college sports right now is very different than what it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. And how athletes previously might have decided to get out of college as soon as possible is changing because they can maybe potentially have these NIL deals, right? And we also are dealing with players that they're not staying at a single school, and that can maybe even make it harder to learn how well they really are, because they're gonna sign a contract effectively every year and go to a different program. So I don't have a good answer for thinking about the impact on the college athlete themselves. I do, the thing to realize is it's very different right now in this NIL transfer portal era than it was 10, 15 years ago, and we've shifted away in such that how historical data could actually predict what's happening now could be even harder with college athletes because it is just such a different dynamic. Yeah. That's a pretty bad answer, but it's a good question. All right, cool. I think we're good. So, awesome. Thanks for attending.